There we go. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be diving into one of the most popular topics in Washington, to put it mildly, over these last few months, which is the DOGE. And we're going to be focusing on our panelists' areas and kind of tapping into what impacts this organization has had specifically on the areas that they focus on, which will pretty much cover everything in this next hour. So before we get started, I want to go down the line and have you each introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about your background and what you're focusing on now. Andy, you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi. Hello.
Test. Okay. Hi, I'm Ann Lewis. I was most recently the Director of Technology Transformation Services at GSA. My background's tech. I was in the tech world for about 20 years before that, in a variety of software engineer and leadership roles. And it's great to be here with all of you.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Mechanic. I'm here at the Niskanen Center as part of the state capacity team working on thinking about how to improve procedure and procedural flow. Before this, I was in the Office of Management and Budget in the front office of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, known as OIRA, where I worked on coordinating regulatory policy. I've also worked for a year on the Hill before that and did 2 years at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve.
And hey folks, Gabe Chaka. I lead our federal workforce and civil service work here at the Niskanen Center. Like Alex, I came most recently from the Office of Management and Budget, where I worked on primarily personnel policy, but a whole hodgepodge of other things. For folks who know OMB well, someone described it to me as like 100 people in a trench coat. And so you end up wearing a lot of different hats. So I also worked on things like the FAFSA refresh last year, Made in America, and a whole bunch of other things. Spent some time before OMB at the Partnership for Public Service. I see a whole bunch of former and current partnershipers here, and that's awesome. It's an organization that's near and dear to my heart, as well as a whole bunch of time in industry.
Great, thank you guys. I want to start out by focusing on kind of our thesis for today, which is what happens next for the DOGE now that Elon is gone. Elon Musk, the one-time leader of the DOGE. So, Anne, I want to start with you. I guess, what are you expecting now for your area and for federal technology in particular when it comes to Elon's departure? So I think DOGE is just the latest generation of the digital services teams coming into government, mostly from industry that we've seen since the Obama era in reaction to the dramatic and well-documented failures in healthcare.gov. In government, you can only operate at an extreme scale, like hundreds of millions of people impacted, significant system-related scaling issues, lots of data, lots of vendors, lots of complexity. And so for many tech workers in industry, it might be the first time that a lot of engineers in particular have seen systems that are that complex. The complexity is just unavoidable. So I think what we have seen from previous generations of digital services teams, what we are seeing with DOGE is facing that complexity head on and being like, wow, okay, how do we deal with not one database, but 10,000 databases, and how do we figure out how to make sense of this and get work done in effective ways? So I think that team has been trying to reconcile the complexity of government with the goals of this administration, and like past and probably future digital services teams are just trying to see what they can do to move the needle. So I think that work's going to continue. I think we've seen a lot of DOGE staff get put into leadership roles in agencies that can give them more ability to grant permission or access to things. But then even when you get access to everything, you're still faced with that complexity. So I think it's still TBD what they'll do to move the needle, especially on legacy system concerns. But their stated goal is to fight fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think there's bipartisan alignment around that. I mean, I'm a Democrat, and I just published a paper on my favorite, 40 examples of billion-dollar tech failures, because everybody's aware that this is a big problem, and all technology workers who come into government want to figure out how to solve it. So I'd be interested to see how they're able to move the needle on that problem. Alice, what about you for kind of the administrative procedure regulatory areas? Is Elon's departure going to have any impact?
So DOGE's role outside of technology has always been less than totally collusive. There's a great deal of ambiguity about where DOGE ends and where the sort of normal agencies begin. And we've actually seen folks who were hatted within DOGE go into political appointee positions within agencies and sort of convert. So the way that I would think about it is less what has DOGE as a sort of entity done, but more what is this administration's political officials sort of doing this push, and how has that shifted as Elon has left. I think what we saw at the start, much like personnel, which Gabe will talk about, is a lot of slash and burn, a lot of complete ripping up without clarity about what would replace it, a lot of quick deadlines that seemed too quick to possibly be effectual, whether that's we're going to rip up the entirety of the federal acquisition regulation, or whether that's the complete end of all independent agencies and all rules having to flow through OIRA, all budget requests having to flow through the budget side of OMB with no real sort of implementation period or time planning. That obviously seems in line with some of the more ideological goals of DOGE. It may have also been the product of other folks within the administration, whether it's Russ Bode at OMB or Stephen Miller in the Deputy Chief of Staff's office. What seems to be happening this many months in, whether it has to do with Elon's departure or perhaps just settling in, is more deliberative approaches to all these topics. We have seen an effort be announced to sort of replace the FAR with something. It's unclear what that will be, but the process is underway. Agencies are sort of beginning to flow through normal processes with OMB. There was a budget request that went out through, I'd say, like mostly normal process, though, there were definitely some corners cut and some unusual parts of that. And we saw, for example, the new NEPA rules, the rules actually just rescinded the old rules and replaced everything with guidance. We could talk more with that. But the transition, sort of zooming out, has been one from a lot of just clear cutting to a slow process where there's now a little bit more deliberation about how do we sort of implement in a world where there's less of what we came in opposition to, but someone's got to replace it.
That makes sense. Gabe, on workforce, what does Musk's departure mean for all the workforce issues that DOGE has been involved in, which are many so far?
Yeah, so I think this is the place where I think perhaps Elon's departure probably is most meaningful. And we're sort of in this like interesting twilight zone around workforce right now, where actually like nobody's like left the government, and I say nobody, like some people have left, right? There are people who've quit, people who've actually retired, who said, forget the Ford, forget the riffs, like I'm out of here, I have better things to do in my life. But the vast majority of the big changes that people are talking about, like haven't actually come to pass yet, right? And so, I think the departure of Elon is an opportunity for cooler heads to prevail, right? Something we know about how he managed his companies, right, is he set really ambitious numerical targets and drive people sort of relentlessly after them, right? And that works great in a manufacturing environment. It does not work so great in a government. And so I think a lot of the workforce disruption that we've seen is a result of that management style, right? Where they said, hey, like we want to reduce the size of the federal government by, 5-10%, some cases more, some cases less. Go out and figure out how to do that, right? And we saw a lot of that in the very early days where executives on the career side of the federal government were called in and said, hey, like you have 50 people, pick 10, right, that you can keep. Totally arbitrary, but it happened everywhere. I think his departure in a world where a lot of these firings haven't actually happened yet is an opportunity for cooler heads to prevail. And I think we're already seeing that, and we're seeing political appointees at agencies walk back some of this stuff. I don't know if folks saw, but the VA very publicly said they're going to step back from some of their most ambitious reductions in force or layoff programs. Other agencies have started re-engaging some of the people who took the deferred resignation program with a fork to say, hey, actually, it's fire season this summer. Would you consider coming back to fight some wildfires this summer, right? Jury's out on how much things will actually be walked back, but I think we start to see political appointees who are accountable, by the way, for the missions of their agencies, start to think to themselves, gee, like, I'm going to be held accountable for the mission of the Department of Agriculture. Perhaps I'm going to make sure that we take a beat and reconsider some of these very hasty decisions we made initially. So I think Elon's departure is really an opportunity in some ways to kind of re-empower the normal political management at a lot of agencies to think more critically about how they want to execute the president's priorities.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to go back in time a little bit and talk about the DOGE's beginnings. We know that it was one of the first things that President Trump launched when he took office. We also know that it took over USDS, which was maybe an agency that people didn't know as much, or a group that people didn't know as much within the White House. And then all of the things that we've seen over these past few months began to affect individual agencies. So, Anne, I want to start with you by asking about DOGE's mission, its initial kind of marching orders from the White House, and how that was received initially in government when this all started. I think there were a few weeks of optimism. So they entered U.S. Digital Service in the same way that digital service cohorts enter government every administration, and then also showed up at GSA and made a presence there, not just in technology transformation services, but in general. I think they're still living there in the sixth floor. So I think the previous cohort of technology leaders thought to ourselves, let's see what they do. What are their ideas? And then what we saw, like others mentioned here, is a lot of really rapid cuts. And it turns out that the things that are easiest to cut quickly are not necessarily what you might cut if you're planning, like, here's our strategy, here are our goals, here are the resources and people we need to achieve them. Even if you decide we're going to do 3 things instead of 10 things, you still need to have a plan and then align the resource planning around that. So unfortunately, a lot of cuts that we saw were easy to cancel contracts that are easy to cancel for convenience. But sometimes contracts that were sort of cut out from the middle of programs that maybe have some mission critical services that they provide, like cybersecurity or rapid response related to scaling or emergencies, as Gabe mentioned. So there's a little bit of like systems running lean that's happening right now from some of the contracts that have been cut for convenience, and a lot of technical staff in particular who have been laid off or decided to leave then from the United States Digital Service, and also technology transformation services, and also digital service teams across government, including a majority of people who were hired under the AI talent surge that was happening last year because they were probationary. So I think we're seeing a little bit of a realignment and readjustment as the new leadership decides what their goals are. And if, for example, a primary goal is AI, and you had just had a few hundred people who were hired who had AI backgrounds, were willing to take 70% pay cuts to serve their country, who beat out 500 other people in really competitive hiring processes last year. If you just let all those folks go, suddenly you have a capacity gap and a critical skill set. So I think we're seeing some issues like that. But the reason why they showed up at U.S. Digital Services is because that is a place that was created, housed in the White House, for tech leaders from industry to come in and try and do some form of tech-related government service. That actually segues perfectly, Alex. I wanted to ask you a little bit about why USDS and what was the history of this organization before they got there? Why was that in the White House, and what do they do?
I mean, perhaps the most important thing is it allowed them to put DOGE into the acronym. That's very important. But less facetiously, USDS was born, as Anne already mentioned, of the failure of healthcare.gov and the sort of searing experience that the Obama administration had in realizing that technology and technology services and implementation could not be viewed as backwater. Increasingly, the effectiveness of major new programs would hinge on their ability to do digital services effectively. This led to a host of things, and USDS is by no means the only part of it. GSA acquired an enormous increase in capacities, and for folks who aren't aware, GSA can sort of be thought of as the sort of primary acquirer of like goods and services for the federal government. So to the extent that you think of these as just more traditional services, that makes a great deal of sense. A number of agencies also grew their tech team and their digital services teams a bunch. Some of them did so more quickly, some of them did so as a result of working with these new entities, VA being the great sort of success story there, and to develop large technology teams. But there was still felt to be a need for a group of eager, experienced, highly competent folks who could sort of bring the backing of the White House to the problems, those healthcare.gov style programs. By situating USDS within the Office of Management and Budget, it accomplished a number of things for the Obama administration, I should say for the first Trump administration, for the Biden administration as well. OMB has the budget process underneath it, which doesn't just mean next year's budget, though that is important because USDS doesn't operate with a continuing appropriation the way that some entities like GSA has can. But it also means that routine appropriations are going through OMB at a regular process, gives them enormous amounts of visibility. It means that when an answer comes back from the agency, we can't do that because we don't have the money. USDS could turn around to their budget colleagues and say, hey, is there any money in any accounts? Or alternatively, the agency might say that's not allowed under a regulatory program. And then it just so happens that OMB also has OIRA in it, and they could turn to their OIRA colleagues and say, do they have authority under existing regs? Can we change the regs? Can we do something about this? Can we, work under the PRA to get this approved more quickly, whatever the need may be? And then management side as well, for problems that cropped up there, that meant that USDS not only sort of had the imprimatur of the White House, which I think the entire EOP, the Executive Office of the Presidency, also has, but it could really leverage the fact that sitting on that second floor of the Eisenhower Executive Office building, being able to just walk down the hall, they could leverage these sort of powers that OMB has sitting at the intersection of all of these different authorities that made USDS, I think, substantially more effective than it would have been otherwise. So when Elon walks in the door, and it should be noted that part of what happened here in the second Trump administration is that he and some others walked in the door before a lot of other political appointees and hit the ground running a lot faster. If it had been a new entity, they probably couldn't have done that. But it being USDS specifically meant that they're inheriting an entity that was really well-versed in going into agencies, getting down into their systems, interfacing with them, working with them on particular problems, leveraging the authorities of OMB. I think in some ways the tragedy is not only mission-based, like what Anne said, but a lot of these capacities and these relationships got jumped, it seems, fairly quickly, and DOGE was actually by executive order formally reclassified out of OMB. But I think that the idea at the outset seems to have been to leverage this unique position that USDS had.
A lot of really good history there for our discussion. Gabe, I want to ask you, has DOGE achieved any of its initial mission thus far? And I think workforce might be a good area to focus on.
Yeah, so I think it's hard to figure out exactly what their mission was, right? Like if you follow a lot of the tech adjacent and like Musk adjacent people that are now in government, there was a lot of talk, especially on the way in, about deficits, right? And like it's clear if you watch sort of DOGE and like Andreessen affiliates go up to Congress for confirmation hearings and all that, they talk deficit, right? So if you look at that as like their prime mission of sort of like rebalancing the budget or reducing the deficit, or tackling national debt, I think they've not been successful, but we all sort of knew that, right? For those of us who have experience in the budget process, it's not possible to solve the deficit on the discretionary side of the ledger, right? And I think federal workforce is a great example of that, right? Federal workforce is a single digit percentage of federal expenditures every year. It is not possible to significantly impact the fiscal trajectory of the country, even if you fired every single federal employee, right? And so, if you kind of take them at their word that sort of initially was a goal, like, I don't see that as being successful. Partially because it's just not possible, like the math doesn't math. If you think about some of their sort of other goals that I think those of us who watch are sort of trying to divine out of it, right? Which is like, to some of Anne's point, right? Being thoughtful about bringing technologists into government, doing things like trying to introduce, or accelerate the adoption of AI, right? I think it's totally plausible that, in some agencies, we're going to see, success in that mission. But the jury's going to be out until, we get a few cycles, frankly, through this stuff, right? Like, for example, at OPM, they've been working through modernization of the retirement process, right? And it's sort of funny because that for a long time was like this like great white whale of like personnel. Like there's a great piece in the Post almost a decade ago where they like found a whole bunch of folks from like the Reagan administration and then the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration and then the second Bush administration, the Obama administration, and they all said, hey, like we've been really trying to get the retirement process like off paper, and they all fail. And they all sort of like chuckle and go, well, maybe the next guy will figure it out, right? So it's totally plausible that that they've solved that. They claim that they've solved it. I think the open question is like whether that holds up, after a couple 100,000 cycles, right? Because like the processes like that, The easy stuff is easy to digitize. It's the tails, right? It's people who've had crazy careers across different pension schemes and all that, that the system will fail on. So, kind of jury's out, I think, on their ability to handle or their sort of degree of success there. But I think at the macro level, we'll just kind of have to see when it comes to workforce. As I said, we're sort of this kind of twilight zone where nothing's actually happened other than a whole bunch of people are hanging out at home on administrative leave. And we really won't know until really we hit like September and the end of the fiscal year and things start to get really real very quickly.
Right, and we saw that with the recent data from OPM and BedScope, that we just haven't seen it yet. We haven't gotten the numbers because that data ended in March. So we were a little bit in the dark in terms of what it looks like right now.
And by the way, they fired all the people who normally are responsible for federal workforce data, such that kind of whole data supply chain from agency HR systems all the way to OPM, which like I could, come find me after, like I'm happy to wax poetic about how important that is. We just are not sure like how FedScope is even going to be able to handle some of this stuff in the future, because all the people who knew those systems and all that history are just now gone.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess for the next, portion of this conversation, I want to get a pulse on each of these areas in terms of what's happening right now. And I think naturally that leads us to the courts, where a lot of these activities from the DOGE, this administration, have been halted and, maybe restarted. We've seen lawsuits against workforce initiatives, probationary firings. We've seen data access cases going through the courts. And most recently, last night, we saw the Supreme Court lift a district court injunction, which is basically allowing these RIFs to move forward, at least for the time being. Gabe, I'm going to pick on you again. Can you explain what the state of play is based on what the Supreme Court did last night and what that means for these RIFs?
Yeah, sure. And I will acknowledge that I'm going to spin through it, but this is head spinning, right? And even for those of us who spend a lot of time on workforce policy, like it is hard to keep track. But I'll do my best. So as you said, the Supreme Court yesterday, lifted an injunction that had prevented the administration from moving forward with its planning for reductions in force, right? I think it's really important to be clear about what the Supreme Court did and did not say. So what they specifically said is that the EO directing agencies to prepare plans to reduce their workforce is likely to be lawful. And I think that's totally plausible, right? The president's free to ask his, if you think about EOs as basically just a fancy memo from your boss, right? Which is really all they are, right? I think people have this like, there's a mystique associated with it, executive orders, but it's really just like direction from your boss to do something. Then, in that respect, it's like totally plausible that the president said, hey, put together some plans and send them to OMB is legal, right? But what the Supreme Court did specifically say is that they don't express an opinion on the legality of the resulting RIFs, right? And the actual implementation of those RIFs. And that, that has to kind of go back to the district court and various courts to sort of through individually whether a given reduction in force is lawful. So, unfortunately, I think the answer, sort of what's next for that particular kind of line of litigation is just more litigation. And we've seen that already. A judge recently ruled that HHS was not able to go forward with some of its reductions in force. They, however, actually got to the merits of the case, right? And, based on the APA and a couple other factors, decided that HHS's plan was not lawful and enjoined HHS from proceeding. I think we're going to see a lot more litigation like that, where judges are called upon to actually weigh out, whether a given layoff package actually does constitute an illegal sort of encroachment on congressional authority. So, kind of more to come there. And I think, it's going to be hairy for a little while as, RIFs start to roll out now that the injunction is lifted at the kind of macro level. And employees come back and say, employees and states and all sorts of folks come back and say, actually, like, you're shutting this agency down or shutting this office down. So that's kind of one line. I'll note that there are a whole bunch of things happening. So just kind of quickly, another thing that happened was an executive order that really made it impossible for a large portion of the federal workforce to collectively bargain. Something like 80 or 90% of civilian unions were sort of moved under a national security exemption, so for folks who may or may not know, federal workers have a statutory right to be able to organize into unions. There's an exception for national security functions as deemed by the president. They took, I would say, perhaps the most expansive view of what constitutes national security. Arguing that the environment is related to national security, therefore EPA is a national security agency for this purpose. I don't really buy that, and I don't know that it core will either. But that's currently, so that's been enjoined as well. The Ninth Circuit actually, I think, is receiving briefs from the government today on that particular case, and I would expect we'll get some degree of resolution there, or perhaps, kind of continuance of that injunction, and perhaps a Supreme Court ruling at some point over the next few weeks and months. So there's kind of that piece. There's the deferred resignation program in the fork, right? Or the DIRP, as some people call it. When we think about the DIRP, we really won't know about kind of where things stand until, as I said, September. The administration's first set of numbers indicated that, it's like 75,000 people kind of took the first one. That said, since then, lots of agencies have continued to offer rounds of, DRPs. So it seems totally plausible to me that we'll land in like the 150 to 200K range on that, right, which is a little less than probably 10% of the federal workforce. So that's pretty sizable. And then we'll sort of kind of see what else happens. There's been some kind of separate work around, the hiring process. There are a couple memos that OPM put out, which is like 90% good stuff, like removing the really lengthy federal resume requirement and removing the requirement for senior executives to write these like horrible essays as their like main way of qualifying for jobs, like really zany stuff that really should have been binned a long time ago. Though those memos also include some really odious, some political stuff, right? Like, a requirement for federal workers to write an essay about their favorite executive order, right? And like some of that stuff that's just like kind of both plainly in violation of the sort of merit systems principles which govern the federal government, but also just really like kind of yucky, and sort of like implausible. It sort of doesn't seem important for a GS5, right? And that's like entry level with like high school degree to be writing about which executive order means the most to them as they apply for a job, as a lifeguard at a, National Park Service pool somewhere, right? It's just not important. So we'll kind of see what happens there. I could go on, but I think those are some of the major kind of muscle movements that we see right now as we kind of look down at the end of the year and start to contemplate a world where lots of people who are on admin leave actually just.
So not much going on.
Yeah.
And I want to go to you on sort of the data access issues that we've seen with the DOGE. A lot of them have gone through the courts. It looks like they're gaining access to more systems. What is the impact of an organization like DOGE gaining access to systems with sensitive information?
So there, I could also talk for about as long as Gabe, and poetically about, my opinions about data privacy and cybersecurity best practices, but I'll try to be brief. So when you have one system, you need access to it to be able to do work on it. That makes sense. And if you are an engineer who's worked on one or two small-ish systems, you might think the first thing you need to do when you enter a new organization is just get all the access so you can figure out what's going on. That is a reasonable software engineering question to ask if your job is software engineer on a small and medium-sized project. However, asking that question, give me all the access to all the systems, all the databases, at government scale is dangerous because if 1 or 25 people get access to tens of thousands of systems with the most sensitive data that the government has on all Americans, not only are the costs of any mistake you might make quite high, and like costs of irreparable harm being caused, but it makes you a very high profile, attractive hacking target by any nation state who's not a friend of the United States. Cybersecurity is a cat and mouse game. You can't perfectly secure any system because humans are involved in these systems and you can always find ways of compromising humans. This is a problem. You could just increase the cost of breaking into a system to the point where maybe only a hostile nation state could afford it. But there's a whole, like, there are sets, it's not even just art and science, it's like a well-established like industry of both art and science. It comes to like helping organizations figure out how to secure themselves. There's not one rule that applies for all organizations in all situations. You have to take into account the threat model that you're using to assess different categories of risk, the size of your organization, the number of people that need different kinds of access, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are these like 20+ year old best practices that NIST has codified in 553, which will always like take up space in my head rent free for the rest of my life. Greatness specification if you're looking for something to put you to sleep. Cybersecurity best practices that include things like principle of least privilege, which is my favorite security control, which means only grant people and computer programs and other kinds of entities access that they need to do their job. So at odds with that is granting 25 people access to everything. So this is the category of like data privacy and access related battles that are being adjudicated at the agency level, because chief information officers, this is like most of their job is to make sure that you don't make mistakes in these ways, but then also in the courts as well, because the Privacy Act is involved. So we're seeing different outcomes for different cases. In some cases, injunctions are upheld. In other cases, I think there was an SSA case that went up to the Supreme Court. That like the Supreme Court, that was like a loss, I think, for the parties outside the government, a win for the government. So at the end of the day, I think what we all need to care about is not who's winning or losing which lawsuits for which systems, but like, are we protecting the data of Americans? Because I think it's like, we could say, like, it's a bipartisan concern to protect the data of Americans from nation states that are not friends with the United States. We need to make choices that allow engineers to get their work done and agencies to achieve their missions, and contractor ecosystems to be able to work effectively with the government without opening up new cybersecurity targets that can harm not just Americans, but America. So I think we're seeing a lot of these like previously wonky behind the scenes data privacy and like access management considerations play out on a national stage in a way that could be net helpful long term, because we all do need to care, like in the same way that like you should not give me your password to your email account, because then I'll be able to break into your bank account. Like, don't do that. Similarly, America should not just go around making it easy to steal like access to sensitive internal systems that protect like the security concerns of Americans, the integrity of benefit systems, and like major national security concerns.
That makes a lot of sense. I guess on another front, within the same tech environment, the workforce cuts really impact the tech environment, because we've seen past administrations struggle with making sure they can get, AI workforce in the government, or the tech workforce in the government. And a lot of the probationary firings were, maybe some of these younger folks. So how has that impacted the government's capacity to deal with a lot of these newer technology focused issues?
And the answer is it's complicated and it varies from agency to agency. I will note that the vast majority of what government calls implementation work, which includes the entire category of things that is like also the entire tech industry, is just implementation. But like most of that's vendored out. I think Gabe made a point about this. The federal workforce has not significantly increased in size over the last 20 years. But the volume of contracting activity certainly has, by at least 100 billion, perhaps more, I forget the exact number. So the contractor ecosystem does the majority of the managing of little databases that compose together to form complex systems, and the writing of code, and the integrating and securing of systems. And so I think we need to, again, it's like complexity and scale are not optional in government. It's not like you hire 10 engineers and they can handle all of Social Security by themselves. It's like you try to establish a technical workforce within agencies that can effectively manage a complex vendor ecosystem with the complexity of a healthcare.gov or a FAFSA, because that's just the scale at which government operates. So I think we need to make sure that to get the public-private implementation right, we have enough tech workers in government who can drive and manage and minimize risk related to large-scale implementation. And I think that some workforce reductions, especially cutting back on product managers and technical folks who can participate in acquisitions processes, that will endanger implementation outcomes because the government needs people who speak the same language as their implementation partners to make sure that everyone's telling the vendors what to do in the right ways. If you have vendor-led projects, vendors do the best job they can, but they're operating within the scope of a single contract. They can't see past, or maybe feel like they don't have permission to see past contract boundaries and system boundaries related to just their piece of the puzzle. And when you have a bunch of independent vendors and teams and systems who should be working together, but no one is steering the ship and telling them how to work together from a technical perspective, you kind of get random outcomes that then lead to billion-dollar failures. So I think it's important to have enough technical workers in government to be able to steer the mostly vendor-led ship.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about the crossover of those issues before. Alice, I want to go to you on regulatory issues, administrative procedure issues. Where are you seeing the DOGE take action in this area? You mentioned a couple of areas thus far, but has there been much activity yet, and kind of what's coming down the pike?
Yeah, with the same caveat that I started with, there have been a bunch of things. I guess maybe I'll start where sort of Gabe and I overlap, which is the firing of heads of agencies, specifically independent agencies. The Trump administration has been quite vigorous in asserting its legal authority to do so. And, we have some clarity from the Supreme Court that the once independent agencies with a little asterisk for the Federal Reserve are not so independent anymore. And that means they've been brought into this same process that I described OMB. They are expected to send their rules, and that actually includes the Federal Reserve through the OMB process, interagency engagement coordination. Their independent budget authority per executive order is no longer a thing. So they're all expected to go through the ordinary budget process, which was not true in the past. And they're expected to comply with general management orders. That's a pretty big sea change. I am optimistic that we'll have benefits. The executive branch has always struggled to coordinate across non-independent and independent agencies. There are capacity concerns here. OMB has been the rare island where there have been no large-scale firings and very few resignations, the best that we can tell. But you are taking a small office like OIRA and asking 40-odd career staffers to now handle a lot more agencies with some very big portfolios, like the entire financial regulatory system. I fear that maybe folks are being stretched thin, but I do think there's some potential there. We've also seen what I'd call some aggressive pushes to speed up anything and everything that could possibly be sped up, which will have a variety of outcomes. Some of it is plainly legal, and I think that isn't always emphasized. So, for example, the APA contains a clear exemption for grants, loans, benefits. If you want to affect those programs without going through notice and comment, you can. That traditionally is something that agencies forswore. They forswore it largely back in the 70s. They're taking those back, and I expect the courts to uphold those. It hasn't been tested yet, but that's likely to survive. That being said, how much they'll actually make use of this is unclear. The reason why you don't just change all of Medicare payments without going through notice and comment is, you might want to know what the hospitals and the doctors will say about your proposed payments before you finalize them and completely radically shift the healthcare industry. So it may be more bark and bite, but remains to be seen. In some programs, they may go forward with no public comment. In other cases, it's going to be really obviously unlawful. So the State Department, under Secretary Rubio, has said we're going to skip notice and comment on all of our rules because they're all foreign policy and that's exempt under the APA. So immigration rules aren't going to go through notice and comment. The court's been really clear here. Immigration is not foreign policy as the APA means it. You still have to go through notice and comment for those rules. They're likely to lose yet again, as they've lost for decades on this theory. So there's that. More generally, what we've seen across agencies in this push period is, I'd say, an absolute maximum of speed over everything else. So we're seeing DOE put out 20 rules in one day, no analysis for why any of them, or no substantial analysis for why any of them make sense as a practical matter, very thin legal argumentation. And at some point, those will be finalized, presumably, and I expect the courts to say that's not a valid notice of proposed rulemaking. You have to go back. That is certainly the long-standing DC Circuit view. I don't think the Supreme Court has been incredibly clear on this point, but it it's likely to go up before then, and I would be surprised, I guess, if very long-standing doctrine gets upset there. This generalizes. So all those NEPA rules I mentioned, they were all put out as interim final rules with no public comment. They are trying to solve that problem by having a post-finalization public comment period, which will then like inoculate them. There is a legal theory here. There's a Supreme Court case that sort of said that maybe that's okay, but it seems like an exception that would swallow the rule, and so it seems like these things are not likely to succeed. Generally speaking, the thing that's confusing is that there's often a lot of bipartisan support for some of these actions. Certainly NEPA has been a point of frustration for a lot of Democratic administrations going all the way back. And yet by pursuing a process where they're not going through public comment, where they're risking losing a year of implementation timeline by having to go to the courts and get knocked out, it seems to me, perhaps running the chance of committing a little bit of an own goal here, when a more deliberative process that wasn't legally vulnerable might have gotten a lot of support. And I think there are examples of that. So the last one I'll use here is an single agency example. The DOD just announced that they're going to be requiring in contracts going forward with defense contractors a sort of defense right to repair. If folks are aware, a Biden administration sort of priority coming out of the left was right to repair laws. These actually have bipartisan support as well, and there has been support from Republican folks like Senator Hawley as well, I believe. But they sort of say that if you buy something, you should have the right to repair it. And DOD has been in terrible circumstances sometimes, where like a ship part is like busted in the Mediterranean, and they have to like fly contractors out to fix it instead of using their own personnel. And Secretary Hegseth announced like we're not going to do this anymore, and it's a real example of some of the ideas that were percolating in the last administration getting pushed further and being implemented by this administration in a way that was welcomed and got a lot of support from folks on the Hill. I think that's likely to have more staying power. Some of the stuff that's like go as fast as possible is likely to consume some period of time before the courts knock it down. And even if the courts knock it down, might not be that long or that durable of a change.
On that note, I mean, what is the impact broadly of yo-yoing policy like that? With the courts saying to halt something or striking something down, what does that mean for the government's operations that can't be that efficient?
This is one of the reasons why folks who have served in government have had a meeting of the following sort. X is something that we're allowed to do, and then someone says like, well, but maybe we might get sued and we might lose, and someone's like, well, if it's only like might, like if we're probably going to do it, why not do it? And someone's like, well, if we lose, we'll have lost like 2 years of a 4-year term, so let's just do it the safe way. And that can be very frustrating, and there are downsides to it. One of the great virtues of the DOGE experience may be to get a little bit firmer on what the like truly outer bound rules are that government rarely tests, because it's so catastrophic to lose, and often it's just not worth testing the outer bounds. But durability matters for government for that reason. I should also note, and I guess I was like a Democrat will also speak for the right here, like it's even more important for the private sector. I mean, if you're a business trying to figure out how to get permitting approvals for some project that involves NEPA and Endangered Species Act permitting approvals, and maybe half a dozen other things, National Historic Preservation Act, some state and local requirements, and you're trying to figure out what might happen if you go through the current process, but then the courts rule that it's unlawful in 6 months, and then you have to really re-go through the next process, like the expense, the delay, the complication, they really pile up. We saw this play already once before. Back before everyone got excited about the idea that CEQ had no authority over NEPA, the first Trump administration did a comprehensive rewrite of NEPA rules. The problem was it took until, I believe it was 2019 when the final rule came out, but someone might check me, it might have been end of 2018. And the litigation took until 2020 to fully play out. The courts held it unlawful, at least in some of the challenges, and private industry, if you talk to them where they wouldn't be quoted publicly, would tell you that they wish that they just could have gotten certainty up front rather than everything, sort of a wish list reg that was going to get knocked down anyway. A lot of the time you see government move slower, there are private sector interests that are actually looking for certainty, and the certainty is being provided by a deliberate, low legal risk process that can be very frustrating for everyone involved, but involves those sorts of trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think we've seen DOGE come in and kind of to some of your points, be kind of a polarizing presence in some ways and maybe push the bounds more than other similar efforts in the past has. So I'm also curious what that means for the federal bureaucracy in terms of, how people are dealing with maybe issues that used to be bipartisan that are now being thrown into a new light. Gabe, I want to start with you. Are we seeing increasing polarization in these areas? And if so, how is that impacting actually getting things done in a bipartisan way?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things going on here. So like one, I want to acknowledge up front that like most of the stuff we're talking about, like nobody cares about, right? Like it is very low salience. Like I care a lot about the federal workforce. I know Alex cares a lot about procedure and cares a lot about tech. Like we, probably most of the people in this room care a lot about this stuff. But like in the aggregate, when you like look at issue polling on like how much do people care about the federal workforce, even now, like 6 months into DOGE, it's like they just don't think about this stuff, right? So there's an element of on the kind of maybe good or perhaps good side. Oh, by the way, that extends to members of Congress, right? Like members of Congress don't ever want to talk about this stuff. Because you can't run an ad. I mean, I guess you could, but it probably wouldn't be a very good ad about how you made the hiring process faster in the federal government, right? Like nobody cares. And so, there's maybe like a kind of slightly positive spin on the polarization or at least the salience of these issues, such that now members of Congress who aren't the sort of usual suspects on management issues are like raising their hand and saying like, hey, actually, like maybe I care about some of this stuff, right? Like, why is the federal government, why is hiring so broken, right? So there's like that, which I think has the potential to be positive, right? And if you look historically, it's taken moments like this, like the last time we did really comprehensive civil service reform was in the Carter administration after having gone through what is functionally quite a similar process that we're going through right now in the Nixon administration with the politicization of the civil service. It really took that to kind of get Congress, off their butts to go do something. So it's possible that, some of the kind of raised salience of this stuff based on kind of what the DOGE has done will end up being positive. That's certainly my hope, as I look forward at our work at Niskanen. I do think on the polarization side, like you've given voice to the other thing that keeps me up all night, right? Which is that, I'm quite terrified that people will think to themselves, like, we've had this horrible experience, right? There are not enough people to fight wildfires or respond to hurricanes or, staff the DOD in a time of crisis or. And they'll say, man, we should just go back to how everything was on Inauguration Day in 2025. And I will speak specifically for workforce. I would just say that would be a tremendous mistake. I say this with huge love to the federal workforce and the federal government. Like my whole life, I've spent doing this stuff. There were things that needed to change dramatically, right? And so, I'm quite concerned that people will like become negatively polarized against reform, and I think that's one of the real challenges with kind of how DOGE is proceeded. I think there's a version of this story, right, where we kind of got a whole bunch of people together and we sort of figured out like, hey, like this is sort of where we could go if we wanted to change these, and that didn't happen. This is all to say nothing of the actual impact on the content of the federal workforce, right? Which is really challenging because of some of the, Schedule F and some of the recent suitability regs and the stuff that will lead to, I would say, like more, like political hackery in the hiring process and in the staffing process. That also gives me a lot of concern, right? If people lose faith that the federal government is in fact a nonpartisan merit-based institution, the question of whether you're willing to go into an office and kind of give someone all of your information for an immigration hearing or social security benefits or a passport or whatever, like starts to get really dicey, right? And that is really scary because that sort of leads to like a spiraling set of negative incentives where people say, well, like the last administration did these loyalty tests. We got to fire all those people who were hired in the last 4 years. Well, that just kind of takes us way back to the kind of spoil system in the 19th century, where the president ended up spending all of his time trying to restaff the government for 4 years, right? Like we moved away from that for good reason. Like the developed world has left behind that way of doing government for a really good reason. And so, yeah, I'm terrified that, we have to find a way to kind of get out of the doom loop. we have to do it really fast. And so, it's my hope that, some of that kind of raised salience will enable us to do it, and that, Congress will be willing to do their part. Certainly that's what we're focused on here at Niskanen, is helping them, for when the day when that comes. But, it's not looking super rosy these days.
Ooh, on that solemn note, Ann, I want to go to you, more broadly on how executive branch led cuts, is it an effective way to go about, doing something like this? What role should Congress be playing? What role should agencies be playing, kind of in your ideal world where an entity like DOGE tackles these issues?
First off, I just want to say I've never been in a meeting where Gabe has not mentioned the Jacksonian spoil system, so if you had a bingo card, you can check that one off. Okay, so there've been a lot of executive branch led cuts, either cutting staff or the delayed retirement, which is functionally paying people to not work until September, and then TBD, what happens there, or contracts cut for convenience. Given how the appropriations process works, agencies have a lot of one-year money on their books that they've been told, don't spend this money. But if we're still in a continuing resolution at the end of the year, then we're still in the same financial state, like the agencies have the same budgets. And we know that there's this thing that happens for agencies at the end of the year, feel pressure to spend or obligate one-year money. Hey Congress, it would be cool if you did something about that. Have a plan here. Like if we're in a situation where at the end of the year, all the DOGE-led cuts that are being counted as this many billions of dollars saved are still on the books, and the Impoundment Control Act still exists, agencies will just take all of that money and obligate it against probably large company flexible contracts like IDIQs, and we'll see a record level of money that was supposedly saved put into the hands of the largest companies who have these existing relationships. Do we want that to happen? I don't know, you can decide, but I think we should have a plan there. Otherwise, the executive branch-led cuts will not have mattered.
That's an interesting point. How does Congress address something like that in kind of an ideal environment? How would they step in to help agencies figure this out?
Not qualified to answer that question, but many people in the audience here are, and I would be very curious to hear from folks in questions after this talk about how could that work, because it seems like it would to put so much political capital from this administration's leadership and folks like Elon Musk into let's cut to save taxpayer dollars and have all that money get obligated against big company IDIQs at the end of the year, that would be a failure. So anything that's not that, I think, will allow us to make progress here. But how much is the executive branch talking to the legislative branch? I don't know. Doesn't seem like a lot. So if there was some public alignment of those plans, or some statement or declaration of here's how we want agencies to behave, especially with respect to one-year money, I think that would be strategic and helpful.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I'm going to pose a similar question to you, Alex, in terms of, more broadly across all of these initiatives that DOGE has taken. Can things be turned around in a way that is maybe more bipartisan, or maybe more, making progress toward these goals that have been in government for a while? Do you see that as a possibility now going forward?
I think it's absolutely a possibility. I think we should be eyes wide open about the fact that it may have to get worse before it gets better. So take the example Anne was just talking about. I think Rusto has been exceptionally clear that they want to test the constitutionality of the Impoundment Control Act, and that will mean that it is likely that a legal case is generated out of that, and that will have to get resolved by the courts. That will mean that there's quite a good chance that, depending on how the case goes, the money will be expended in less useful ways than they might have otherwise been able to be expended. But in the aftermath of that sort of clarity, something better could emerge. And I think that generalizes. There are opportunities to build on or pull back from maybe what has already happened and sort of go about it in a way that would be more durable and more bipartisan and hopefully just better for the public. The way that would happen, I think, is the product of a few things. First of all, have agency leadership that is, yes, it's true, like unusual, often highly connected to Trump personally, not sort of traditional Republican leadership. That gives them an enormous amount of flexibility. We have seen the Secretary of Labor, for example, make a series of moves that I don't think a traditional Republican Secretary of Labor would make. And you know, with the support of the president on things like enforcement in the immigration labor context. It's unclear, particularly in Stephen Miller's view, that that's actually going to be something that's followed through on. But the question was, is there a possibility? And I think there's absolutely space, whether it's at energy, whether it's at DOT, where Duffy has, I think, repeatedly been clear in the aftermath of the FAA mess, where enormous amounts of flight cancellations happened in Newark, as well as it's all over airports, that like there's an open-mindedness about perhaps bringing back some of the people that were let go, about reforming procedure to right-size things, about working with Congress to improve the process. FAA is the rare agency that goes through regular cyclical re-offs. And you know, I think as you go down the line, there's a version of this that could emerge from a sort of more pragmatic, less perhaps like doctrinaire, less locked into ideological sort of tentpoles process to just like make things work. And I think the reaction of the administration post the tragedy in Texas with respect to their plans in FEMA is the hopeful version of this story, whereas a plan to completely dismantle FEMA had been the sort of standard view that they were espousing. After the crisis, they're saying it will be reevaluated. We want to make sure that localities have all the resources that they need. There is, of course, a lot of emphasis that it wasn't from the administration, that wasn't their fault, and there's always the blame game. But I think the fact that they're revising some of those plans speaks to a consideration, and also just broader context, right? On the left, we have an increasing set of concerns about state capacity, about abundance. There are now partners that this administration can work with on discrete issues that could probably get bills over the line if they want to pursue that path. All of this, though, is just a possibility, because I think there are also forces within the administration, and you know, if reporting is to be believed, Stephen Miller is perhaps chief among them, who don't want any of what I just said, who have a very different vision and who want to pursue that vision to the hilt and to pull resources from all other sort of parts of government to pursue things like deportation agenda, to sort of systematically dismantle the state. The dismantling the state, that's not going to, that won't work the way that I was just talking about. But there is, I think, possibility for something better here, and I fervently hope that the better thing happens.
I think that's a great note to end things on for today. I want to thank our wonderful panelists for giving us so much of their time. If y'all could join me in a round of applause for that. And I want to thank also Ms. Cannon for hosting this event today. Great. I think that it concludes our panel. Thanks.